Please welcome longtime supporter of PEN America and award-winning international author, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie.
Hello, thank you. It's very lovely to be here, to be part of this. I sometimes joke in the way that one tells a joke that isn't really just a joke, that I'm very grateful for PEN America, because if the Nigerian government were ever to throw me into jail for something that I said or wrote, then PEN would be there to get me out, even if it meant organizing a jailbreak. PEN America's work, PEN America's existence is in many ways an assurance that writers all over the world can, perhaps even should, dare to speak. And Dare to Speak happens to be the title of Suzanne Nossel's book. And I want to thank Suzanne, who is a source of inspiration for me, for her unfussy and tireless dedication to PEN. So after the attack on Salman Rushdie, I could not stop thinking about it. The brutal and barbaric intimacy of a person standing inches from you and forcefully plunging a knife into your flesh. And this because you wrote. I decided to reread Salman's books, and reading became not only an act of defiant support, but an act of meaning. It was important for me to remind myself how much words matter, how much books matter. In Salman's memoir, Joseph Anton, he writes about an Egyptian sheikh who said that if the Egyptian writer, Naguib Mahfouz, had been properly punished for writing his novel, then Salman Rushdie would not have dared write his. And shortly afterwards, one of the sheikh's followers stabbed Naguib Mahfouz in the neck. Salman then writes, "The elderly novelist survived, fortunately." And that line, "the elderly novelist survived, fortunately," felt particularly poignant and moving to me. Salman survived, but what happened to him should never have happened. And while we insist that violence can never, ever be an acceptable response to speech, we must also not deny the power of words to wound. Words can wound our spirits. Some of the greatest hurts of my life have come from words that somebody said or wrote. And some of the most beautiful gifts I have received have also been words. Yes, words have power, and it is in fact because of their power that we must protect them. I think of all the times I have learned new things, let go of old beliefs, and broadened my worldview because speech was free. If we stifle speech, we stifle the possibility of learning. The man who stabbed Salman forgets that there are many brilliant intellectuals who disagree with Salman and who can write back. As the British journalist Kenan Malik put it so well, what is sometimes deemed an offense to a community is more often a debate within communities. So I sometimes joke, yet another joke that really isn't just a joke, that I say I'm very interested in the ideas of people who disagree with me because I believe very nobly that it is good to hear different sides of an issue. But actually, the truth is that I'm interested in their ideas because I want to understand them and therefore be better able to demolish them. We must protect the values of disagreement and agree that there is value in disagreement. It troubles me nowadays how quickly people are fired for something they have said. Not because I like or support what they say, I often don't, but because it is a silencing that leads to a larger kind of silencing. The act of firing a person without engaging with what was said, sometimes without even saying exactly what was said, almost suggests that what was said has a certain power, if not truth, which then leads to reasoning such as this: they would not need to censor us if we were wrong. When I first came to the US to attend college, many years ago, I was struck by what seemed to me a particularly American ideal: the addiction to comfort. This addiction to comfort manifested itself in such things as aesthetically displeasing but supremely comfortable sneakers, drive-through banking, hospital visits where one is constantly asked, "Are you comfortable?" rather than the Nigerian norm of being expected to grit your teeth and get on with it and go through a very painful procedure. So this addiction to comfort is harmlessly convenient, even desirable in many cases, but often leads to a kind of silencing in public discourse. I grew up in Nigeria under the military governments of Generals Buhari and Babangida, and I remember stories of journalists being jailed, beaten, killed. I remember my parents and their friends on the campus of the University of Nigeria talking about politics in hushed voices, even though they were in our living room. But only until I came to the US did I become so attuned to a very rigid idea of how you should say things and how not to say things in public discourse. I learned that in conversations about America's difficult subjects, like race, like income inequality, the goal is not truth. The goal is comfort. Comfort for all, ostensibly, but in reality, comfort for the most powerful. I learned that the fear of causing offense, the fear of ruffling the careful layers of comfort, can become a kind of fetish. Things are left unsaid, questions go unasked, and because questions go unasked, ignorance festers. Many American universities are well-meaning in wanting to keep students comfortable, but they do so, I think, at the risk of not just creating an insular, closed space, but one where it is almost impossible to admit to ignorance. And in my opinion, the ability to admit to ignorance is a wonderful thing because it creates an opportunity to learn. Even the literary world is addicted to comfort. I have never understood why it is considered valid criticism in this country to discredit a piece of literature for not having something called redemption. I like redemption as much as anyone else, but this insistence on comfort, which H.L. Mencken wonderfully called the cult of hope, can sometimes become an obstacle to truth-telling and therefore becomes its own kind of speech suppression. There used to be a general tendency in the United States to think of censorship as an essentially foreign problem. And this even after the US Supreme Court decided in Citizens United that money is speech. And if a country decides that money is speech, then really true speech is dead. But this was because dramatic kinds of censorship were not in the political mainstream. Now they are, especially with the ongoing hysterical efforts to ban books. And Dave Eggers recently wrote a very insightful piece in the Washington Post about all of the inherent contradictions of this movement. But the censorship that most matters to me is the censorship that is not to do with the reading of books, but is to do with the writing of books. Literature is the love of my life. I'm most alive when I'm writing fiction. And there is, I think, No other human endeavor that requires freedom as much as creativity does. To create, one needs a kind of formless roving of the mind to go nowhere and anywhere and everywhere. And it is from that swirl that characters and worlds emerge. Many writers in this country today are not able to create fully because they are drowning in self-censorship. Self-censorship is not the sort of thing that one can do a public show of hands about, or I would have done it here. Shall we? No. We may not be able to measure this self-censorship objectively, but we can deduce it from the books we read, from how books are read, and of course, from social media. In America today, orthodoxies have become religions, and these orthodoxies are enforced brutally. Books increasingly are read not as art, but as politics. Characters are absurdly expected to be ideologically pure, as if any real person in the world is ideologically pure. It feels to me as though we are now expected to speak of the ugly sides of human nature as though we are ourselves inherently incapable of any ugliness. And because we are unwilling to recognize within ourselves the possibility of what horrifies us, it leads to self-censorship. Sometimes we are afraid to speak because we are tribal and our views do not align with those of our tribe. It is true that speech is very much about power, but it is also true that social media has reshaped that power dynamic. There is, around creating, a climate of fear and a reluctance to acknowledge that fear. Because there are huge costs, social costs and emotional costs to writing and storytelling. And it is unfair and perhaps too simplistic to ask individual writers to just take on the cloak of courage and plow on. We have to create a better enabling environment for writers to write. And I thank PEN America for its work on this issue. My experience with self-censorship is shaped by my different selves. In my personal life, I often censor myself from love. Some family members do not believe what I believe, and I don't believe what they believe, but we love each other. And in certain conversations, I choose silence because I ask myself, what's the intent? What will I achieve by speaking? In my life as a citizen and as a writer, I am less willing to silence myself because there is so much more at stake. I think the reason behind speech matters. Speaking with the sole intention to provoke feels empty and meaningless to me. I do not at all suggest that our intent must be noble or worthy. I've never done very well with worthiness myself, but that in a humane and deeply felt way, our intention must be true. And it is my belief that storytellers and artists begin with that, a true intention, and the intention to be true. And so here is a question I have been thinking about. Would Salman Rushdie's satanic verses be published today? Possibly not. Would it even be written today? Literature is essential because it reflects us back to ourselves. It tells us how things feel. It goes where other art forms cannot go, the mining of human motivation. It is impossible to create literature in a culture of self-censorship. We end up telling lies, and how can it be lies that we will leave behind for the generations to come? And so as we look forward, we must start again to assume good faith. Yes, some people are not of good faith, which I think is what that modern word troll means. But we cannot because some people do not act in good faith, then decide that the principle of good faith itself is dead. More voices need to be heard loudly and consistently in favor of conversation. It is time to begin again to demand not just truth, but also nuance. I think, for example, that a nuanced argument for any social justice movement is stronger when it is nuanced. It is also a more confident argument because it does not feel the need to simplify in order to convince. And finally, I would like to end with a very small story. Some years ago, the Nigerian government passed a law that makes it a crime to be gay. An acquaintance of mine supported this law. We had a conversation about it, which got a little bit heated. A while later, he read a short story of mine in which one of the characters was gay. But this character's sexual orientation was not the main thrust of the story. After he read the story, he told me, by the time I realized the character was gay, I already liked him. It's one of the most hopeful things that anyone has ever told me about my work. It reaffirmed my faith in the power of storytelling. Because of a story, this acquaintance of mine saw the humanity of a person whose human rights he had earlier been in support of squashing. Stories matter, and words matter. Thank you.